Hello, everyone. Welcome to the breakout session. I'm very excited to have this discussion with everyone. My name is Reed Coster, and my role at BetterWorks is OKR practice lead with our professional services organization. And I have been with BetterWorks for coming up on 5 years this spring, involved since the beginning in helping organizations design and launch successful OKR programs. I'm really excited about discussing this topic with everyone here. You know, as a reminder, these breakout sessions are meant to be interactive. I really would love to be able to chat with people and have a dialogue as much as possible. So we have a couple options for how that can work. So in the lower right, there is a chat option. And so, you know, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to put them in there. I also am going to pause at a few points and ask a couple survey questions and also just pause for an open discussion. And when we get there, you have the option to raise your hand. And my colleague, Janelle, who's helping run this session, she can help you turn on your camera and basically you'll join the chat with me. Okay, so a couple options for how we can make this more of a two-way conversation there. And Janelle, I'm not going to put you on the spot much, but if you do hear a voice pop in, it's probably because I asked her to monitor the chat or help with finding a question. Okay, so this is great. We've got a lot of folks in the breakout right now. So welcome everyone. I see you're still all joining. Again, this breakout session is meant to be a dialogue, and we're going to talk about strategy execution through OKRs. And I do want to talk about this topic, especially if you join the morning keynote, right? I think strategy execution, we all know, is a very hot topic in management these days, and a lot of executives are ranking it as one of the biggest headaches in their organization. How do we solve for this? And what we're seeing, especially at BetterWorks, is more and more organizations are choosing OKRs as an approach to help solve for better strategy execution, right? They do see the power of OKRs being a way to translate strategy into a set of cultural practices and execution processes that the organization can adopt, right? But something I do want to discuss and frame this discussion around is OKRs are a great way to do that, but a lot of organizations fall into the same trap. They make a similar mistake, right? They can see clearly how it's going to help, but in reality, in execution, they fall flat. So what is this main mistake that I and a lot of us are seeing with organizations that are trying to use OKRs for strategy execution? You know, I would pose that this mistake is over-rotating on the strategy side when implementing OKRs. And what I mean by this is, imagine an organization has this well of energy and attention they can pay to an initiative like OKRs. And that well is spent, or the water is taken out of that well disproportionately to focus more and more on strategy, right? The planning phase of OKRs, whether it be annual or quarterly. And there's little energy and focus left for execution, right? So what I'll call that right here is the planning trap, okay? So, hey, we want to translate strategy into execution, but when we start using OKRs as an organization, what we'll tend to see is this pattern, right? We're going to hold a bunch of meetings. They're unstructured. They always go over the agenda, and our executives get together and spend precious time talking about direction, talking and spinning our wheels, right? And then as we're writing our OKRs, there's this sense of waiting for the perfect idea to present themselves. There's an obsession with perfect. Hey, we had a great meeting. Let's not finalize anything yet. Something perfect might come up, right? And then once we have that great idea, is the OKR written appropriately? You know, are we following the formula? Would it get an A+ if John Doerr were grading it, right? And then because we spent so much time on these OKRs, let's make a big production out of announcing them at the beginning of the year, right? All of these things expend a lot of energy in an organization, right? And it's still focused in my mind on that phase of OKRs, which is just looking at strategy and translating strategy. But we want to get to the idea of execution, right? I think one of John Doerr's most famous quotes, and if you've read Measure What Matters, this pops out, is that ideas are easy, it's execution that's everything. Okay, so if we have an OKR system that's just helping us talk more and more about our plans and our strategy, we haven't fulfilled the promise of OKRs as a means of strategy execution. So some ideas here. How do we tip the scale, right? How do we tip the seesaw so that our focus in our OKR program is not just on planning and all that well of energy we have as an organization is not spent up front, but is really spent on executing against the strategy. So a couple ideas. Let's talk about 3 different topics and ideas for tipping the scale. So first idea, I think this makes clear sense, is that we need to streamline the planning. Planning and that strategy translation phase in OKRs is important. But if we can't streamline it, we are going to exhaust the well, right, of our energy resources. So meaningfully streamlining planning so that it can happen quarter over quarter and leaves us with energy to execute is really important. I'm going to pause. I see we have a lot of folks on the line. So I'm going to launch a poll just to get a sense when we think about planning in regards to OKRs. How much time does your goal setting process take? So you might use OKRs, you might use a different system, but just ballpark, what do you think the effort is as you plan around goals or OKRs or any sort of strategic work? I'll just keep this open for a while as the answers roll in. Okay, interesting. And by the way, I'm noticing a little bit of noise. I apologize if you hear construction work, but the neighbors are doing a little bit of hammering today. Okay, it seems like a lot of people have submitted their answers. So let's take a look at the results. Okay, 145 of you responded. Thank you. So the first option was under 3 weeks. About 34% of you said that. That's great. Actually, I'm surprised by that number. 3 to 6 weeks. That's the majority of everyone at 47%. That's fantastic as well. 6+ weeks, about 21%. Okay. Yeah, and what we would love to see is that number, 6+ weeks, that's a huge signal if your process takes that time over time that we might be falling into that planning trap and a lot of those descriptors of the planning trap we just talked about. But this is great. So we have a lot of folks who can get through a planning process in 3 to 6 weeks and some that are doing it in under 3 weeks. So I'd love to talk with people about those experiences too. So let me jump back to our presentation. So if we're streamlining our planning process and we're trying to get from long process to a short process, one way to do that is to set really strict guidelines, right? I do believe that these guidelines are good, these constraints are good, right? Because exhausting our energy just around the planning phase, it's going to be a huge problem for actually executing against our OKRs. So one idea here is your OKR program, when you launch it, should have a very clear and strict set of guidelines about how this OKR process should take place and in how long. Okay, so one step, and what we're looking at here is, just an example of how an organization might structure that planning process. But you first look at how are we going to phase OKR setting. So we'll define levels that OKRs belong at. And this doesn't mean that you don't have many levels in your reporting hierarchy. It just means that for these windows of planning, we want to designate that these sets of OKRs need to be set within these windows so that they give inspiration to the groups below. right? So you might say for our quarterly OKR process, for example, we're going to have a strict 2-week window, and we'll start before the quarter ends to help review what our OKRs were the previous quarter and crowdsource ideas from the organization to help set a clear vision for the next 90 days. But it's really important that as we start sharing those objectives with our department leads or the organization, we have to have that done in the sense that we're confident in broadcasting them by the start of that quarter, right? So we are giving a lot of weight to a deadline, and people bristle at deadlines, but that's a very simple yet powerful way, right, to keep ourselves on track. So you might say we're going to start our planning at the top company level, start sharing and collaborating with department leads after 1 week, but allow them 2 weeks to finalize their OKRs. And in the first week of the quarter, those department leads are working with their teams and further down individual contributors to finalize OKRs. This gives us a window where planning really starts before the end of the quarter, but everyone is set on a clear set of aligned objectives by 2 weeks into the quarter, right? Execution is the focus starting week 3. Okay, that's pretty clear. Now, you might say, well, our strategy and addressing our strategy does take a lot of time. We spend a lot of time talking about a 5-year plan. I'm not saying that quarterly OKRs need to revisit your 5-year plan every quarter, but we do need to respect that you are thinking big picture, especially at the executive level. So you might have a varied calendar or process when we talk about the year start versus the quarter start, right? So this is just an example of how you can be flexible, but still clear and disciplined about how OKR setting works and when in an organization, right? So maybe your executives spend 3 to 4 weeks at the start of the year because this is part of a process of your greater 5-year, 1-year planning at the organization level. Okay, so this is the point I'd like to discuss, streamlining planning. So I would love to pause and just start a discussion. So I guess thoughts from folks on those of you, especially who are planning your OKRs in 3 weeks or less. What are some tips or tricks or processes that really work for you? And again, if you want to volunteer to just join me in chat, that's great. I'm going to go into our questions here and see if I can find anything. Oh, I saw a question which was, what does Q2 through 4 mean? I hope I answered that. In that slide, it was just showing that the process outlined here was for our quarterly OKR setting throughout the year, but we might have a separate process when we communicate OKRs at the beginning of the year. And Janelle, I think a lot of the questions are interspersed in the chat. Do you have any that you're seeing that we can discuss? Hi, Janelle.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. So one came in from Al Brown. He asked, what advice can you give to an OKR champion about how to encourage leadership to communicate and evangelize the top-level OKRs to the rest of the organization, particularly after any kind of initial announcement?
Yeah, what I would encourage you to do as a champion, and that's a great question. And for those of you who are sort of new to OKRs, there is this role of, a program lead or a program champion in an organization that really helps this process become successful quarter over quarter. Your executive sponsor is critical, but the person who is really coordinating all of these events and activities keeps the train on the tracks, so to speak. So one way that you can make sure your executives understand and continually communicate objectives quarter over quarter is to really simplify for them how they can communicate. those OKRs, right? So I'm showing you a calendar, and the calendar is just saying within these windows, we want OKRs to be set. But maybe the announcement feels a little scary or a little unclear for your executive team, right? So what I would do is partner with them and maybe find a model for helping them talk about the OKRs. So it's simple, it's straightforward, but it packs a punch for the organization. And, just one way off the top of my mind is, I've seen this model of wins, learns, changes work really well. You have this as a quarterly topic when you have your company all hands, and it's a way to have your leaders talk meaningfully about what you just worked on and celebrate some of those wins and discuss learnings, but then also talk about what's going to be important for the next quarter, what's been revisited at the executive level in terms of OKRs. The underlying that question, how do you get the buy-in from that champion? You might have to work and just share some of these ideas that we're talking about today, right? And just say, look, we can talk about our OKRs as examples of our strategy quarter over quarter, but that doesn't get us closer to completing them. And if you can buy into this idea, I would love your support by, publicly announcing and pushing for people to engage with OKRs quarter over quarter. All right, I'm going to scroll through some more questions here. And thank you, everyone, for sending these in. I'm seeing you're definitely taking some time to type these up. Oops, sorry, the chat is moving. Yeah, here's Janelle. Janelle's helping me.
Yeah, I have some good ones. So I have one from Aaliyah. How do you advise to start with OKRs for organizational excellence? For example, building an engineering org of excellence.
So I think OKRs are powerful for helping drive excellence, organizational excellence in sort of any department, because they allow you to do what I think of as upstream planning. So many organizations are locked into reactive work and planning around how they execute within their teams. With OKRs, the idea that you regularly at the same cadence talk about what is a priority within your group that is aligned to the company vision and the company OKRs gives you this chance to say, what's really important amongst this team, not just for, closing the books, shipping product this quarter, but for delivering on our vision and our strategy. Okay, so the constraints of the OKRs on your team are that you should really only focus on 3 to 5 and then limit the number of key results. So that makes you make tough choices, balance what's most important, what isn't. And a lot of times what you end up seeing is that, yes, execution against delivering our roadmap is super important, but we do need to find time and a place to work on making us more operationally excellent in this group. And that can feed into a specific OKR shared by the team, which gives it prominence, brings it back to your attention throughout the quarter. Right? And you're not just focused on reactive work, you're now looking at things that have to get done to solve those upstream problems. All right, let's take one more, and then we can, by the way, we can continue this discussion all day long. We have a number of different spots in this presentation to stop. But Janelle, is there another one you can share with me that pops out?
Absolutely. We have so many in the chat, so thank you guys so much for making this interactive. I got one from Kim. She asks, what are some ideas on a board standpoint role within an OKR creation versus staff, predominantly for a nonprofit organization?
Oh, interesting. I think it would be fantastic to include the board in sharing OKRs and potentially giving feedback before they're finalized. What I do tend to see, though, is sometimes an executive team for an organization uses board commitments as the starting place for their OKRs. And we tend to see these objectives at the top level that really look like run the business metrics and don't have that impactful inspirational punch that well-written OKRs can have, right? And so I would make sure that the board understands sort of the difference between how OKRs are used as a way to translate what's important to the organization from a board level into these meaningful objectives that the team can rally around, right? And then they can give some feedback and tell you which ones they're most excited about. But if you just show them OKRs and say, is this what we should be focused on? There might be some trepidation that from the board. They're saying, well, we've got something else that we need to see, during our board meetings, right? So yes, you need to manage those numbers when you're an executive team, but you can also drive the direction of the company by using the power of a well-written, focused OKR to move the needle, make change in a very specific way that quarter. Okay. Yeah, these are awesome. I love doing QA. I'm also going to call out that next week we do have an office hours, so anyone can join, and it's the same sort of format. So I think in the follow-up there will be a link for that, so we can do more and more QA next week if you want to join that session. Let's jump to point 2 though, because I do want to make sure we get through a couple of these ideas, and then we can revisit some of these specific questions. But going back to that idea of tipping the scale, like moving all of our energy from the strategy translation phase to now execution, I think another big tip to take away would be implement a tracking process, right? So we gave clear guidelines on when OKRs should be set at what level and what the due dates are. Well, now throughout the quarter, do people have the same clarity around when we're tracking and talking about progress for these OKRs? So before we dive into how to think about that, here's the second question I'd love for you all to participate in. How often are people at your organization engaging with their goals throughout the year? Right, so we have once a year, a few times a year, once a month, or weekly/bi-weekly. Yeah, this is great. Everyone's voting. And some people are chatting, so I appreciate that. A few times a year at most. Thank you, Wayne. Okay. That's terrific. I'm just going to end. I appreciate all those votes coming in. But this is interesting, right? So 15% once a year. Okay, this is the very traditional old model where a lot of goals are tied to performance targets, and we only really visit them when it's time to go through our performance review. A few times a year. Okay, so we might have a couple touch points that are designated and we are able to revisit progress. Once a month, 25%, then weekly, bi-weekly, 20%. Okay, this is great. And I would say, I think a few times a year, that's probably where more traditional goal setting models, you'll see engagement with OKRs. But what I'll argue here is that a big reason for OKRs not being revisited throughout the year is because we don't give clear enough expectations for when and how we want to revisit them. Now, this is a battle, right? Because we could ask our organization to follow choice number 4 and mandate everyone is talking about progress every week or bi-weekly, but that might be a little much, right? We're worried about that limited well of energy that we have as a company. And if we ask too much and we demand too much tracking, now we're down in the weeds again, and it's hard to get our minds back up to that high level of strategic thinking. So here's a thought. When you are launching your OKR program, or if you have an OKR program that you want to take to the next level, make sure you've defined the types of check-ins or progress reviews that you want to take place in your organization, and then put in some sort of mechanism or explanation of how those check-ins should take place. So here's a model, right? Here's an example solution that an organization could use. One type of check-in is your team status update. So any collaborative cross-functional team that shares OKRs, they have to determine at what cadence do we talk about our OKR progress within our team meetings. I know a lot of teams meet weekly, but that might not be the cadence to talk about OKRs, right? So it could be every 2 weeks in that same meeting, OKRs are a topic, or once a month. Okay. Similarly, yes, we have collaborative teams that talk about OKRs, but what about managers and employees talking about their OKRs? Now, one-on-ones are powerful ways for managers and employees to use OKRs, right, to stay focused on what's important. But what is problematic about asking all one-on-ones to be focused on OKRs is that we then get into this idea of what tasks are you working on? What tasks did you complete last week? And for a manager, that can feel a little bit, or sorry, for an individual contributor, that can feel a little bit like micromanagement. So one idea is to say, we encourage OKRs to be a discussion point in your one-on-ones, but as an organization, we're going to add a milestone. Maybe it's mid-quarter, maybe it's once a month, where we want managers and direct reports to have more thoughtful conversations about their OKRs, right? Not what updates have taken place since we last talked, but more what roadblocks are you seeing? Are these still the most strategic priorities based on how things have changed this quarter? Right, so this is just a proposal for that type of check-in taking place maybe once in the middle of the quarter. And then similarly, your executive team, they might have longer-term OKRs, maybe they're annual, but it's still important to talk about them maybe mid-quarter, maybe once a month to say, do we have meaningful updates? If we need to steer the ship, if we need to update our top-level OKRs, should we make an announcement, right? And so having a calendar like this with expectations is super helpful. And I will also note that at all three of these levels, right, all three types of check-ins, it's useful at the end of quarter to have a meaningful reflection. I see this over and over, that reflections are sort of the forgotten check-in for OKRs with organizations. So this is just a model, but I find this really important to not just leave it up to people and say, find time to talk about OKRs, but make it explicit. We want you to talk about, and we're going to make it easy for you to talk about OKRs, and we're going to do it in a lightweight way. So one more point before we open up discussion again is we can't just introduce all of these new expectations for OKR tracking milestones and then have those milestones be really heavy, right? Again, we're going back to that metaphor, the well of energy. If we just ask people to triple the meetings they have, they're going to be frustrated and exhausted. So the way you introduce a more disciplined calendar like this, where you still talk about OKRs, but you're not exhausting people, is make sure you have a model where the check-in is fast, quick, and meaningful. So one idea for those team meetings where people get together, they talk about shared OKRs, maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's once a month, is to ask for a very simple data point to be presented in the meeting. Is this OKR red, yellow, green? Right? Is it off track? Is it at risk? Or is it on track? Okay, we're not going to dig through every progress update since our last meeting. We're not going to review data that everyone can see. And if you have a platform, like BetterWorks where you track your OKRs, instead, we're going to have a discussion about this one data point, red, yellow, green. And that's a really powerful way to take what could be a rambling, unstructured meeting and just focus it. The team can talk about reds and yellows, jump in, jump out, and have a meaningful discussion to keep these on track. I've seen this as a super successful way to make check-ins more regular, right, and not exhaust people. So let's pause. Discussion 2. I'd love to hear if people around this topic have had meaningful ways of implementing regular progress updates, what's felt like the right cadence or structure of those types of meetings. So if you can share those in the chat, that's great. And again, if someone actually wants to talk, I believe you can raise your hand and Janelle can broadcast you live. I am getting some questions about software specifically, about demos, et cetera. So we're not going to walk through that today, but a lot of these ideas that I'm talking through, these designated milestones for execution, are things that are useful to schedule and structure in BetterWorks, right? So making it something that you can actually track and see if it's happening, as opposed to just asking people generally to do it. So Janelle, any interesting questions?
We do have some I can read from the chat, but I actually have a few people raising their hands. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Iman up on stage,
Okay,
and then
great.
we can go ahead and collaborate with you. So give me one moment to get this up.
Oh, that's great.
And actually, Iman, if you're still listening with us, can you actually turn on your camera and microphone? Thank you. And then now I can bring you up on stage.
Hi.
Can you
Hi, Iman. Yeah.
Hi.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if you remember me.
I do.
Yeah.
It's good to see you.
So we, what was it, like 4 or 5 months ago, I joined the
Has it been that long?
training certificate, successfully finished it, and now we are actually in the process of implementing OKRs. What we ended up doing is starting with a small team. That is very important, and bring all those teams together to reduce the meetings. As you said, people just don't want to be involved in too many meetings. So just decided to start with a proper drumbeat that just goes every 2 weeks. We have this 1 hour meeting where 4 teams come together and they share their progress on their own accounts. And it's all transparent, it's fast, it's very to the point, because it's 4 accounts and 12 people. You need to have a very clear agenda of what you want to achieve in the meeting. So I just saw your slide back there of how you can have also just discussing OKRs. One of the challenges was that we don't really get to discuss the OKRs because it's so tight. But now I see that, like, in 6 weeks' time, you can just set in a session, but you don't talk the progress, but you just talk OKRs general, or how are we doing it.
Yeah.
And that's been really working for us. People are happy with the way we are doing it now than before. So it was. I'm just learning so much about OKRs from you, man. Thanks for that.
No, of course, and thanks for the question, Iman. So, could I ask you? You said your meetings are really fast, or they tend to stay within the agenda. Do you have any tips for having it be a really tight agenda?
Yeah. So what we do is I run these calls. I set them up, and before that, 48 hours before that, I send the agenda to everybody. And again, before that, I don't know how long we're going to be able to do this, but at the moment, I just sit down with our managing director for 30 minutes to discuss the agenda points that we want to discuss. It's like, is this good? Are we going to do this? And also, we point out who's going to discuss which points. So who's going to have the lead on each topic, and how long do they have to discuss? Yeah. This has changed our way of working so much. There is no off-topic discussion anymore. It's just like boom, 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 and moving on. Yeah. And everybody's very happy with it.
Yeah, that's great. And the agenda itself, you know, when you break an agenda down for these types of meetings, sometimes it might look like 5 minutes here, next item 3 minutes, next minute 8 minutes. I mean, it might look silly, right? But that is one way to be super efficient. Make sure you address everything that's important. And I've seen through the check-in meetings, but also through scheduled workshops, where yes, we want to have rich discussions, but people do appreciate even the fact that we're cutting off the thinking, you know, at that very specific time. So
yeah, exactly. At the end of the most important thing is that people come out of the meeting knowing that progress was made, things have got done, and they know what they need to do after. It's also important after what happens, because I sit again with our managing director for half an hour discussing the action items that came out of it. Is this okay? And are these challenges the ones what I got? Is that the same what you got? And then once that is done, we send it out again to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And thanks for joining, Iman. Yeah, sure. I'll talk to you soon. So one other thought I just had talking to Iman is, he said it's what happens after the meeting. Oh, maybe some ideas were raised, but we didn't even get to touch on it. What's great about just making sure you have these milestones or touch points is that it just resurfaces this into people's consciousness, right? So yes, we had a meeting where maybe we only got to talk about this OKR for 3 to 5 minutes. We didn't touch everything, but what we did accomplish was it surfaced it back to the top of everyone's consciousness. And that's a fantastic achievement for an organization that wants strategy translated through OKRs to be relevant and executed upon throughout a quarter. So great. Janelle, do we have anyone else we can bring on for a quick chat? And then I'll move on to the last topic.
Yeah, so I do have a few people hand raising, and I have plenty for Q&As. So with about 10 minutes left, which one would you prefer?
Let's just bring someone on. This is fun. I like
Great.
Seeing people live.
Fantastic. So I have Mike Hogan. Mike, if you would like to come on, please turn your video and microphone on. I can bring you on stage. Thank you.
All right.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So one of the things that we do, I'd be interested in you commenting on this, is we do weekly meetings, and we, from a team perspective, consider them performance management meetings. So we look at OKRs, which are, and we look at them in unison with our, what we call our health metrics, which are BAU tracking. So we basically are saying, what are the, we're not going task by task, but kind of like you said, we're doing the red, yellow, green for the OKRs, and we tie that to confidence level as well. And the reason, and then below that, we're showing what the key health metrics are that we're keeping our eye on. Yeah. Because the idea is if there is anything that's changing the green status of our health metrics, it may impact our confidence level in achieving our OKRs. And then thereby, it's also going to affect what our key priorities are for that particular week. And then the last thing we talk about is the forecast for anticipated week for the next, or anticipated work for the next 4 weeks. So the idea isn't to go in there and dive deep into anything other than what's red and yellow, and the relationship between performance of stretch goals, the OKRs, and the health metrics. So I'm just curious, how do you see that balancing act between kind of your BAU health metrics and your OKRs?
So is your team where that's your agenda, Mike? Are you a leadership team or a group of managers, or are you more? We do
it all the above. So the leadership team has the annual OKRs, then they have their own quarterly OKRs, and then the teams create their OKRs in a way that are going to support those company OKRs.
Yeah. I guess what I was going to say is what I tend to see is that, at different elevations within an organization, you might need to pair, different metrics to monitor with your OKR. So I have seen this before where balanced scorecard doesn't disappear, right? Because you use OKRs, but it's a relevant, it's a relevant artifact considered alongside OKRs by certain leaders, right, at certain elevations in the organization. So I do see that it's relevant in different ways for different groups. Yeah. So I think that's great, and I think your example of that meeting is a really great structure to make sure you're not diving too deep, into any levels. But one thing I do think is important is you just should always be conscious about the different personas in your organization, right? So if you have teams further down in the organization and maybe they aren't looking at like strategic metrics in the same way that you are, I'll use that balanced scorecard example again. That might be a little higher level and less connected to the day-to-day work of that team. Maybe it's not something we recommend that they manage alongside OKRs, and we keep their focus, like a laser on those OKRs, and it's a little bit easier to manage over time.
Well, we look at every team as they all have their health metrics for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Not every team has to have an OKR, so we're not.
Okay. Yeah.
So the idea is if you have OKRs that are going to drive meaningful value to the business and support the strategic OKRs, then create them, but don't feel compelled to create them if they're not going to do that. So in the spirit of transparency, again, kind of like your calendar, company level OKRs are created and then shared, and then the teams are viewing those, and then they are looking in terms of whether those are going to be shared or they're going to create OKRs that usually support the KRs of the strategic level.
That's great. And that absolutely works. So one big note I want to share with everyone from your model is that, OKRs might not be the only process for tracking throughout your organization. Just be crystal clear how the processes fit together and for each group, right? So if you're not clear about that and you just introduce OKRs as, hey, this is a great way to become aligned and focused, you're not answering the question of how it works with existing legacy processes. So, so thank you, Mike. I'm very conscious of the time here. So we've got about 5 minutes. So let me go ahead and just get through our last point, and then hopefully we have time for one more question. I'm really excited by how much people are asking questions. I'm so sorry we can't just answer every single one, but hopefully we have a chance soon, maybe on our office hours call. So last point around tipping the scale from strategy translation to execution. I do want to talk about this idea of empowering teams of teams. So the team of team concept, and I'm just going to skip our poll question here. This language is really popular in organizations right now because of Stanley McChrystal's book, right? It's a management book, and it talks about restructuring organizations not to be top-down command and control hierarchies, but distributed teams of teams. And, his story was essentially that taking over command of troops in Afghanistan, they're dealing with a very nimble, different enemy, and he was stuck in a command and control hierarchy where he was a bottleneck atop an organization that had to make decisions throughout a really large group of people, right? And so as they were falling behind, they needed a way to make sure that they were making quick decisions. They were allowing teams to make their own decisions within a network of transparency and commander's intent. Okay, so what I think is powerful about this idea is if you are thinking of OKRs as a way to accomplish agile planning and developing these strong teams of teams, a leader's role is not strictly being the final decision maker throughout an organization. Their main role is to create the copper wire for connectivity, right? You're getting ground truth up and through the system and be the ultimate network connector. Okay, so this is interesting. When you're rolling out OKRs as a leader, then, is it a great opportunity for you to review and see what everyone's working on in their OKR and make sure you can, dictate what those OKRs look like? I would argue that's still a command and control mindset. Instead, what you can do is say, are our OKRs showing a way that we're becoming a more connected set of teams, right? And so what I always propose to organizations rolling out OKRs is, yes, you care about your OKRs being complete, but as a leader, what we really want to start seeing is whether or not that copper wire of connectivity is strong, right? Whether or not this network of teams is online, right? And the messages are flowing throughout. And so one really important step is to say, yes, we want to achieve our OKRs in full, but let's make sure we're measuring the connectivity of the system and care about the connectivity of the system. So as a leader, you might want to say, I want to monitor that and make sure everyone owns at least one OKR quarter over quarter. We're having those meaningful scheduled conversations and updates are happening within a certain time frame. To me, monitoring this information is as important as each individual OKR being complete, because I at least know that the tenets, like that cultural transformation that OKRs can bring, has a chance to be achieved because OKRs are alive and well in the business. So with that, last question, Janelle. I know we have technically 2 minutes and we have a hard stop, but I would like to squeeze in one more if you can, select one from the chat.
Absolutely. So I have one here from Chad that says, have you ever seen any metrics that are good to measure OKR adoption and utilization across layers, top layer first?
So, this last slide I showed about adoption here, being able to segment who owns what and how often they're logging in. We are able to see that by default in BetterWorks through our reporting functionality, but it also allows us to view it by role and within a hierarchy, right? So you could just apply these same numbers to whichever layers are important in your organization. So going back to our first set of slides about those phases of OKR setting, maybe you have top company, department level, and then team OKRs. You could ideally measure how strong is ownership and the momentum of our OKR updates at each of those levels, right? So it is super useful to have that visibility, because being able to tell what's happening gives you a chance to intervene and change it. So if you're seeing a group where higher levels are not engaging, there's a good chance lower levels are in for a rough ride quarter over quarter. So with that, I see it's 11:15, and I know that these sessions might just kick us off pretty soon. But I do want to thank everyone for joining. This was a lot of fun. It became a whirlwind at the end. But I hope you can all stick around for the rest of Goal Summit today. If you just navigate back to the agenda screen after this, you can click on the top, the top meeting at the page and just join what's coming up next. So this was great. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you all, on later meetings that we're holding. So thanks, everyone.